The Second Ottoman Egyptian War exposed the true weakness of the Ottoman Empire to the West as it grew increasingly unstable. Egypt, under Muhammad Ali Pasha, attempted to gain complete independence from the empire, as well as recognition from the Ottoman Empire of their control over Syria, which is the modern-day Levant. Following the collapse of the Ottoman armies, Egypt attempted to expand further into the Ottoman core and threatened to push as far as the Bosporus. The great powers of Europe, Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, chose to prop up the failing empire with a naval intervention in Alexandria and Aden. This scenario asks, what if this intervention did not occur or was defeated in some way? Here's just some quick background that is relevant to the scenario. The Ottoman Empire is in total disarray. Just 20 years ago, the great powers sided with the Greek uprising that started from the then independent Ionian Islands. The Egyptians, vassals of the Ottomans, were sent to quell it. They were promised territories such as Cyprus. They initially had great success, but their fleet was completely destroyed following the intervention of the great powers, siding with the Greeks. After the war, the Ottoman Empire chose not to give the Egyptians Cyprus. Thus starts the Egyptian rebellion, which succeeds and brings in control of Syria. The Ottoman Empire just started the second and final Egyptian uprising by demanding Syria back. The French had ambitions in northern Africa. They had begun expanding into Algeria and needed to solidify their holdings. A very strong guerrilla effort would humiliate them all the way up to Algeria's independence. They hoped to make gains off the Ottoman Empire's Tunisia and Tripolitania. The Russians had secured themselves as the protectors of orthodoxy and the Slavic people. They were rapidly expanding southwards and wished to integrate their southern khanates, the last remnants of the Mongol Empire. They considered this territory to be, by all rights, Russian. This set them up for a conflict against the British Empire and the East India Company, who wished to expand northwards into Afghanistan. The Russians and British end up locked in a fierce struggle over this territory. There was in fact one great power that nominally sided with the Egyptians in our timeline, France. The French wanted to gain further influence in North Africa beyond their holdings in Algeria. They eventually chose to back down in the conflict because of the entrance of the other powers. It is quite possible that had another country pledged support for the Egyptians, the French would fully join the war and their navy would prevent the blockade and eventual invasion of Alexandria. I see two possible contenders for this position, Austria and Russia, who will be played off of each other. Russia has three main territorial ambitions relevant to this conflict. They want to expand control over Central Asia and Afghanistan, prevent the British from getting in instead, take control of the Balkans from the Ottoman Empire, prevent Austria from getting in instead, and expand control over the Black Sea, again, by taking territory from the Ottomans. All this being said, why wouldn't Russia choose to side with the Egyptians, considering that they both have claims on the Ottoman Empire? Quite simply, they view the Egyptians as a bigger threat than the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire as of this time was quickly falling apart, beginning with their earlier war against the Greek succession. Now, with the Egyptian War, it was clear that the empire was in decline and would be unable to hold on to their territories. Russia would rather have the Ottoman Empire stay existent, but unstable, so that they could use their growing nationalism and separatism to seize territory, than a strong Egyptian empire that they would be unable to bully around. In our timeline, following the surrender of the Egyptians, Russia uses Christian tensions in Palestine to justify occupying the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, starting the Crimean War. If Egypt instead dismantled the Ottoman Empire, the Russians would be unable to use these and other tensions to their advantage. This would also apply for expansion into the Black Sea. By the start of World War I, the Ottoman Empire ends up losing the majority of their territories. Egypt becomes a British colony, Tunisia a French one. Tripolitania becomes Italian Libya, and their Balkan subjects declare independence and declare war on their former overlord, taking even more territory. The Russians were absolutely right on this prediction. The Ottoman Empire also checked British colonial adventures into Arabia, and thus slowed their gains into Central Asia. Therefore, the Ottoman Empire indirectly stabilized the region and allowed the Russians to continue their slow and steady expansion. These problems could be solved by Egypt meeting in advance with Russia and promising a partition of the Ottoman Empire, as well as limiting their expansion in Constantinople. I predict that the empire would quickly spiral into collapse. The Russians could argue that to ensure the protection of their northern puppets must be brought under Russia. This would offer the Russians the opportunity to fulfill their territorial desires more immediately and provide a strong ally in the region focusing against British colonialism. The French would be much more willing to ally themselves with the Egyptians, especially because of the good relations that were forged with the Russians during the war in Greece. Meanwhile, the Austrians could be influenced to at the very least stay neutral in the war by being promised territories like Bosnia and Montenegro. Perhaps by promising Serbia, either independent or as a puppet of Austria, the concerns over a Russian expansion could be temporarily alleviated, especially if the earlier Russian deals are made in secret. Prussia would likely choose to either stay neutral or ally themselves with the other great powers, instead of risking souring the relations and the destruction of the Holy Alliance. I couldn't see Britain choosing to intervene in this matter, especially with the other great powers so clearly against them.
The specific political maneuvers are not particularly relevant for the purposes of this scenario, and I can't say for sure if these or other means are taken to convince the great powers. Now that we have started our point of divergence, let's explore its effects. As the Ottoman Empire signs the Egyptian treaty, the Middle East is forever changed. The Egyptians move into their predetermined borders, and the Ottoman Empire is left as a rump state. The Persians smell blood and pounce, quickly seizing Baghdad. They use a precedent set by Muhammad, which has major Arab influences, to justify this territory. The Egyptians, meanwhile, would rush to meet them. I'd expect a major skirmish in the territory, where the Egyptians, weakened from their battle against the Ottoman Empire, busy with internal problems, and unwilling to significantly damage relations with the great European powers, would choose to negotiate this border and would possibly request mediation from France. This would further their diplomatic ties and legitimacy in the eyes of Europe. At the same time, the Balkan territories are in complete chaos. Cut off from the Ottoman market, turmoil and anarchy would run rampant as rebellion quickly takes hold. The Turkish population began a massive migration away from the territories as violence spreads. Russia seized the opportunity and, in the name of protecting ethnic Slavs and Orthodox Christians from the turmoil, intervenes and takes full control of them from the Ottoman Empire. Austria and Greece expand further into the Balkans as Bulgaria is established as a fully independent state. The Egyptians continue to subjugate their neighbors in Arabia. 10 years later, Egypt is quickly, following the reforms of Muhammad Ali Pasha, begun to catch up technologically and politically to their neighbors, particularly Russia. A voice calls out from Europe and is answered by millions. The Italian peoples have unified themselves as the Kingdom of Italy, and this desire for national unity continues to spread across Europe as yet another round of liberal revolts sweep the continent. These are not unheard in the Egyptian Empire. Following increasing centralization from the Pasha dynasty, even larger crowds gather and demand unification, 40 years earlier than in our timeline. And thus, Arabia is born. Increasing unrest in the Arab territories of Persia evolves into a full secessionist movement. This is a major threat to Persia, as the loss of these Arab territories will likely lead to the loss of many of their border territories in other places which are not ethnically Persian. The Arabian War for independence would be terribly bloody. I predict this to go one of two ways. If the Russians choose to side with the Arabs, following their previous alliance with Egypt, Britain would then side with Persia. Who would win? I can't say. If the Persians win, their border will freeze here. We're already so far removed from the original timeline that I can't predict much further than this. When the Great War of the Timeline inevitably happens, it is likely that Egypt will side with the faction opposing Britain and would try to take their Arab territories and the Persian territories as well. Persia would side with Britain. If the Arabs win this war, they will not stop in Persia, but would push into the British Jerusalem coast following massive revolts, and the Arab people are unified. This country would, without the colonization of our time, be far more successful, and would likely secularize because of their large religious minority groups. Zionism, if it ever becomes as influential as our timeline, would be one of the largest threats to stability. A semi-autonomous Jewish region is possible. If the Russians do not get involved, the war will see Arabia take the contested territories from Persia, and a long hateful dispute will exist between them. Russia and Great Britain will seize the opportunity and take some territories off the border. The Egyptians will, like earlier, demand the liberation of the Jerusalem coast and take advantage of its increasing unrest. The Egyptians may honor the British claims in Persia in exchange for the territory. I would see the British accept such an offer instead of holding on to a failing territory. The Egyptians framed this not as a liberation from colonialism, but a unification of Arabs, protecting the stability of other British colonies. And that is the scenario. Arabia will enter the 1900s a strong regional power, espousing nationalism and unification. The revanchist Persians will probably end up starting the next major conflict in the region, and Afghanistan could very well be this world's powder keg. The lack of a major Persian force to keep the Russians and British away from each other could very well turn that Cold War hot.
Other potential conflicts that I see are between Arabia and the French over Tunisia, between Arabia and the colonial powers over the Sahel. The Arabs will need to play the desires of their neighboring colonial powers against each other and remain neutral if they are to survive the next global conflict. If they do, they'll enter the future far more prosperous and peaceful than the region is today. Extremist Muslim and jihadist movements will fall to the wayside without the poverty that propels them forwards. I could see liberalism take hold within the country, especially because of their pluralist roots, or strong monarchist sentiment leaving the country, similar to the Kingdom of Germany because of the role of the Pasha dynasty in its formation. I made a lot of decisions in this map that I'm sure people would consider questionable. Like in Prussia, I decided to leave it as one country, just based on the idea that, like, sure, de jure, Saxony-Anhalt would be independent from Prussia, but de facto, there's no way that they could act against them in any of the wars or diplomatic plays I mentioned without there being a major conflict between the two, which Prussia would, of course, win. That's why I decided to leave them as one country. For some reason, Finland, the Baltic governance and whatnot are also going to be considered directly annexed into Russia because they are going to side with Russia in all of these places. There's no chance that they don't. Um, you'll notice I decided to make Algeria one country as opposed to Mascara and Constantine and all that. I decided that they would be acting more as autonomous regions as opposed to separate countries. I could see the argument for both. That's just the one I personally decided to go with at the moment. I'm not a historian, so don't take my word on that. Africa, I decided to leave out as gray because differentiating between what's a tribe, what's a country, what's an autonomous region, it's too much work really for me to be worth considering, right? It would just be ridiculous for the purpose of a scenario that's completely irrelevant in every single way from them. Um, Maybe a lot of borders like Nigeria, or even like colonial borders, I chose not to advance over time. Like, sure, technically they would be advancing at the same time as the scenario. I just considered it not worth my time. You'll see Russia doesn't slowly creep through; they just take everything all at once. Again, it's not worth my time to consider when exactly would all of these things happen. I did make a few mistakes. I kept saying the Pasha dynasty, which I was so tired when I made this. Um, this is not accurate. Pasha was not Muhammad Ali's last name. Pasha was like his rank, so that was inaccurate, and I apologize for that.